next challenge, maybe, is the fact that literature reports land use very differently. So this was, and we've already heard this in the morning presentations, that land use and land cover is reported differently in different cartographic materials and then therefore in different publications. So what we tried to do was to harmonize these land use classes reported in the publications in order to make them comparable. I will mainly talk about forests today, but we also have some information already about urban agriculture and grassland change. And in order to compare the studies, we calculated an annual rate of land change based on a formula that is derived from the compound interest law and was suggested to be used by the Food and Agriculture Organization to assess land change. And as I said before, because all of these studies, they report very different areas, they report different percent of land cover type at the beginning of the study, and they span very different time periods, reaching from a couple of years to hundreds of years. We just wanted to make sure that these studies are comparable, so what these graphics here show is basically that there is, I'm sorry, I'm really bad with things. What these graphics here show is that there is not a strong relationship between the absolute annual rate of change that we calculated and the area of the case study, the percentage of cover at the beginning of the study, or the length of the study in years. So it's okay to compare them. And let's look at some of our first results. This here is forest cover change in the Carpathian area. Don't be put off by this graph, which looks a little bit confusing. I'm missing a part of it here, but basically here we've got a timeline starting in the 1700s, reaching up to now. And these lines here mark the three periods of time that I've been talking about: the Austro-Hungarian time here, the socialist era here, and the more recent period with the transition and the EU accession. The y-axis is the annual rate of change, and this line marks the border between studies that report no forest cover change, that report loss in forest cover and gain in forest cover. And basically these bars are, each one is a case study. So each bar represents a case study. This is the starting point of the study. This is the end point of the study in time. And we calculated the annual rate of change for this period, which in this case here is minus 10% forest change. So one thing that we can read out of this graph initially is that there is more studies across the Carpathian region that report an increase in forest cover, starting with the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and less studies that report a decrease in forest cover. Also, for the time period of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy reaching out to the Second World War, we have the highest proportion of studies compared to the other periods that report a decrease of forest cover, so deforestation in the area. We also have most of the studies which in the socialist period, 86% of the case studies that we looked at report an increase in forest cover. And this is probably due to the fact that there was a lot of logging in that era, but there was also these reforestation politics across the communist countries with different tree species. And then since the 1950s up to now, we have very few studies that report a decrease in forest cover, and most of the studies, or most of the recent studies, report an increase again of afforestation since the 1990s. If we try to put this data on the map, this is what it would look like, and the way we read this map is that each one of these locations is the locations that you've seen previously on the other map. The bubble, the size of the bubble will tell you the amount of increase or decrease in forest cover, whereas red is deforestation and blue is reforestation, and the yellow the yellow dots will be a fairly constant forest cover in the area. And if we look at this through time, we see how forest cover changes in the Carpathian area across the Empire, the socialist period, the transition period, and the EU accession in the Carpathian Basin. And these are the studies that span multiple periods that I mentioned earlier. And we can again see that there's quite more studies, or a high proportion of studies reporting deforestation until the 1950s. There are a couple, this is obviously the economic development of that period, the war, which led to a lot of deforestation. But we also have some interesting phenomena here, which we can see. For instance, we observe a forest cover increase in this border area of Ukraine and Poland, which was an area which experienced depopulation around the Second World War. So the people, the Ukrainian population moved back to the Ukraine, the area was depopulated, and there was a recovery of the forest in that area, or down here in Romania, where we had the afforestation politics of Carol around Sinai. And one point that I want to make here is that these case studies have been done by different scientists for a reason. And this doesn't by far mean that they capture the real trend across the entire region. Usually case studies are chosen because they are interesting. And this is a factor that we have to keep in mind here. And this is what leads us in the greater project to the idea of mapping historic land use change across the entire Carpathian Basin and comparing it with the results of these studies. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the increase in forest cover change during the socialist era that we see here due to, as I mentioned, the strong afforestation politics of that time. Of course, in lowlands there has been some deforestation due to the expansion of agricultural areas, and then some other trends that we see with strong deforestation around mining areas in southwestern Slovakia, for instance, that have been noted. And as I mentioned, most of the studies actually report that forest is regenerating across the Carpathian Mountains. I'm just going to show the same graph that I did before for agriculture. And very few points that I want to make here is, again, we read this as we did before, the timeline, the annual rate of change. This line here that marks no change in agricultural areas. So what we can see here is that during the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Second World War, 63% of the studies that we looked at report an increase of agriculture, which was obviously the agricultural intensification of that, of that time, and the expansion and the intensification. And more recently, a trend that we all have seen in literature is the fact that agriculture since 1990s has gone through an abandonment phase. 82% of the studies report abandoned agricultural land in the area. For grasslands and shrubland change, and there's quite a few problems here, it's very hard to assess. This was one of the classes that we looked at, and we had troubles because different studies were reporting grassland in different land cover categories. There's hard to see a trend here, but we can see that there is a decrease of grassland in the socialist period, and a fairly balanced amount of grassland change since the 1990s. And this is probably because this is a class that captures a lot of the transition in land use change. So a lot of abandoned agriculture will be captured in this part here, agricultural land transitioning to grassland. But grassland that has been abandoned for quite some time will be captured in this class here because it's already transitioning to forest. And for the urban areas, the trend again is fairly clear. There is an increase in urban areas across the Carpathian Basin, starting with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 81% of the studies report this. And then same with the industrialization and urban development during the socialist period. There are, of course, some studies here that are situated in mountain regions that have gone through depopulation due to population movement to cities. and then also more recently with the tourism development and holiday home development, 85% of the studies report overall urban growth. As part of the studies, we also looked briefly at drivers of land use change, and this graph here shows the 4 land use classes that I mentioned before, with the change classes at the bottom, so deforestation and reforestation for forests, for example, and then the different colors are the different drivers that have been cited in the literature as influencing land change. And I just want to say that it's interesting to see, for instance, that overall the economic and the political factors throughout the entire Carpathian Basin play an important role, but also to see that for agricultural change, the agricultural expansion is mainly an economic factor, whereas the social demographics play an important role recently for agricultural abandonment. It's also interesting to see, and we'll hear more about that, where the climatic factors come in to play a role in grassland and forest change, or the cultural factors, which are mainly driving, again, pasture and meadow change. Overall, we can say that through this study, we've seen that in the Carpathian Basin there's been some intensive work using historic cartography. I wasn't aware about much work being done in the Romanian Carpathians, and this is where your expertise comes in, and this is where I'm very grateful to be here and happy to develop on this, to include more data. And we also saw the need to harmonize and make these studies comparable. It was quite a challenge to put all the data together and bring it to a common ground, let's say, whether it's related to scales, the way that the land cover is reported, the areas, and so on. And we also saw that there's very interesting differences between the countries, the regions, and the different periods. And this is also maybe I want to emphasize on the bias and on the fact that case studies are often chosen for a reason, whether it's the data or whether it's an interesting process that is going on in that area, and that they all contribute to a very broad understanding of land use change, but it would be nice to see the overall trend of this work as well. And then some of the general trends. We know that the Carpathians have been going through significant land use transitions in the past 300 years, starting with strong forest harvest in the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and more recently with forest succession. There's been strong agricultural intensification and extensification in the area, following more recently due to politics and socioeconomic factors leading to abandonment. And then the semi-natural areas have been going both through an increase and decrease, and the trend of the urban sprawl that I mentioned before. And just before I wrap up and say thank you, I want to mention all of these people that I want to express my gratitude to. First, the support of NASA and the University of Wisconsin, which has enabled me to come here. But then all of these people that have been published data and were willing to share it with me, and along the lines of this conference and all the efforts that Geospatial.org is doing of sharing information, all of these people have done so, and I hope that some of you will do so too. Thank you.